So just to introduce myself, my name is Carl Latham, and I'm Head of Sales and Partnerships at Ontoforce. Today, I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Michael Van Houten and Martin Robbins, who I'll introduce more formally in just a second. And we want to welcome you to our webinar entitled Elevate Your AI and Machine Learning Analytics with Knowledge Graphs. Before we get into today's webinar, I just shortly wanted to introduce Ontoforce for those who are unfamiliar. At Ontoforce, our mission is to really enable life sciences companies to unlock hidden insights from data. And through our intuitive data and technology solutions, we transform complex data into actionable insights, therefore streamlining drug development and accelerating new treatments to patients. And in a future where the rate of breakthrough will be determined by accessibility to knowledge, since 2011, Ontoforce has been leading the charge towards a life sciences industry without barriers to data, where empowered stakeholders across the business can collaborate to bring drugs to market faster. At Ontoforce, we really believe in empowering citizen data science, and we do this by providing an intuitive user experience with our Discover platform, ultimately giving users data science power. And there are three main components to the Discover platform that I wanted to highlight briefly. Firstly, from the right is our powerful data ingestion engine, where you can integrate your internal data alongside 70 public data sources that we pre-ingest into the Discover platform. And you can also complement this further with your licensed third-party data sources. There is an integrated knowledge graph with pre-ingested public ontologies that can harmonize your disparate siloed data sources. And finally, a fully customizable user interface that can be tailored according to specific use cases. Today, Discover is deployed across 4 solution areas: research and development, clinical, regulatory, and cross-functional intelligence, with 9 pre-built applications, including target identification, clinical trial design, and competitive intelligence. These 9 applications have pre-packaged public data, customizable plugins, and pre-built visualizations and widgets. And what that means for our customers is that we can deliver fast implementations that bring value fast. Now, before I hand over, I will shortly introduce Michael and Martin, our speakers today. Firstly, Martin. Martin is based out of the UK and is head of product management at Ontoforce. And he's a leading expert specializing in semantic technology and knowledge graphs. With extensive experience in data, machine learning, and health technology, Martin excels in demanding B2B environments within highly regulated sectors. Martin joined Ontoforce early last year, bringing years of expertise in knowledge graphs from previous roles. As a product leader, he's passionate about building strong teams and empowering them to solve complex problems through clear goals and structured organization. Our second speaker is Michael Van Houten. Michael is our VP of Engineering at Ontoforce, where he has excelled for several years. His career includes roles as VP of Engineering and Chief Technology Officer at various international tech companies, bringing a wealth of experience to his current position. At Ontoforce, he manages the technology and product roadmap, aligning the company's strategy with the latest technological advancements. And with that, I will hand over to Michael and Martin for today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Carl. Let me just very quickly share my screen. And hopefully you can see the first slide there. So we're going to take this webinar in 3 main parts. Firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of knowledge graphs in AI and machine learning generally. So, why are knowledge graphs and knowledge platforms so important? So, such a useful partner for machine learning applications. Following that, I'm going to walk through a number of examples. I know, looking at some of the responses to the questions ahead of the webinar, a number of you are fairly early in your journey towards AI and machine learning applications. So hopefully there are some interesting ideas, concepts, things that might trigger thoughts about things that you can do within your own organization. And then I'm going to hand over to Michael, who's going to take a more practical look at best practices, and how can we build out knowledge platforms to support the kinds of AI and machine learning applications that you're going to want to roll out in the future. So I want to start just by talking a bit about what it is that knowledge graphs do. And in the industry, we tend to talk about knowledge graphs in quite a sort of abstract and almost impersonal way. So we talk a lot about integrating data silos. We talk about ontologies and aligning data to ontologies. We talk about adding semantic context and labeling to data. But I think it's important to understand that when we're talking about data silos, what is a data silo? It's usually a group of people somewhere. It's a department, it's an organization, it's another business or collaborative group. And so really knowledge graphs are about connecting different groups of people, different organizations. It's a collaborative platform. It's a way for different groups of people, different actors, different agents to work together with a shared understanding of the world or a domain and solve problems in that space. And alongside collaboration, the other thing that knowledge graphs really bring is the kind of clarity, the accountability, the foundation for good governance. And so pharma, healthcare, the areas that we operate in are very heavily regulated spaces. AI itself is an area that's a growing area of policy concern. So governments and policy experts are really working on new regulations all the time about how AI is used, what data is used to train it, how the results of AI are then used and communicated. And this leads to strong requirements around how knowledge is used, what processes are followed, which graphs are very strong for. So, graphs are excellent for auditing and correcting knowledge. They make gaps in knowledge very apparent and allow them to be swiftly identified and corrected. They provide strong provenance and an audit trail of not just where data has originally come from, but potentially how it's been processed to get to the point where the user actually sees it. And it provides that space for different agents to work together to refine and improve that understanding of domain knowledge over time. The graphs are a collaboration tool, but a really important part of any successful collaboration is enforcing common standards, processes, and norms. And so the reason I'm saying all this is because, in a sense, the same challenges, the same requirements, the same needs that people have and organizations have are also true of artificial intelligence and machine learning applications, that the needs of machine collaborators are very similar to the needs of human collaborators. So they need that clear, unambiguous understanding of the source data. They need to be able to show how they're reaching a particular conclusion and communicate that to other people, and to be able to show that the provenance of the data used to drive that conclusion. Like humans, they need to be able to update working when an analysis, when new information becomes available, and then ideally feed the results of that analysis back into the pool of knowledge that everybody is sharing. And you might be tempted to ask, well, does all of this matter? Aren't we moving towards a world where AI is largely automated and it doesn't need to collaborate with people? It can figure this out on its own. It can understand source data even if we don't help it in any way. But the reality is that no matter how good and impressive AI and machine learning gets, however capable it is, however much it's automated, there are always going to be human decision makers in the process. There are always going to be regulators, investors, stakeholders, people who need to be able to understand what this thing is producing in order to make decisions about it in a regulated environment. And of course, an AI with access to better or more appropriate source data is always going to have some advantage over one that doesn't. And so really the point of this first section is that in the same way that knowledge platforms support collaboration among and between different groups of people, different organizations, different departments, they also, I think, have a role to play in supporting collaboration between humans and their machine counterparts. So what do some of these types of collaboration look like? I'm going to go through a number of fairly high-level examples just to give a flavor of some of the different options and approaches that are available. And partly this is to give some interesting ideas, but what I also want to kind of take you through is almost an ascending level of maturity, starting from applications that are more about sending data to a machine learning algorithm or an AI, and gradually moving up the chain of more deeper integration between the AI, between the knowledge graph, to drive higher amounts of value in the future. And essentially, the more these technologies become integrated with each other, the more value can ultimately be driven. So if we start at the most kind of basic level with just classical machine learning, why are knowledge graphs so important for these sorts of applications? So let's imagine that we have a large pool of data on patient populations, and we want to perhaps identify patients with a high degree of cardiovascular risk or a high propensity for some other condition. In traditional data science, probably the first thing that someone will want to do is to look at all of the data that's available connected to patients and try to identify the key features, the raw data attributes about patients that are most important to feed into the machine learning model. The problem, of course, is that those features are scattered across all kinds of different data sets and different types of data. So, in this domain, for example, we might have patient records in FHIR or SNOMED or a similar standard if we're lucky. You might have lab results for things like blood tests, cholesterol tests, other things. We may have sequencing information for patients, which may be able to be linked to information that we have about specific genes or groups of genes that are associated with levels of risk, which we can then find out about from things like medical journals and clinical studies that are being published. And of course, in each of these sources, you've got data that's coded differently, structured differently. And so by combining those data sources around a single ontology, bringing them into one platform, the knowledge graph becomes an incredibly powerful tool for feature selection and extraction. And I think a key point here is that this is where we tend to focus a lot on the underlying technologies when we talk about machine learning, but also the user experience becomes incredibly important. So as user experiences in knowledge platforms are becoming more sophisticated, more powerful, we're reaching the point where a typical user can come to a platform. They don't necessarily need to know the underlying structure of the graph or detailed information about the data model. They just want to be able to select a bunch of patients, find the connected attributes and data that they're interested in, condense all of this together into a single flat table, and be able to export that or pass that via API to whatever machine learning platform they're using. And this is why when we're looking at cases like that, certainly at Ontoforce, for us, the user experience, the interoperability are two incredibly important things when thinking about how these platforms are going to be used for ML tasks. That's the first and the simplest case. I'm going to step up a gear here. So we've looked at the idea of flat data being queried from the graph. But what if the machine learning is able to actually use the structure of the graph itself to reason about the underlying data? That's the idea behind something called graph embeddings. And so I'm going to take a little step back here and just talk very briefly to what do we mean by an embedding, because it's a topic that comes up a lot around graph applications in machine learning. So another context that people might be more familiar with for embeddings is in natural language processing. And an embedding is basically a way of representing a concept with a long string of numbers. The numbers are based on the relationships that concept has with other concepts. So if you were training a language model on, for example, a bunch of source documents, like scientific papers from PubMed, what you would do is for each concept, each significant word that you're interested in that source data, you would produce a string of numbers that shows how frequently that concept is associated with other concepts in the text that you're processing. So in this example, the word cat, for example, might be represented by a string of hundreds or thousands of numbers representing how closely that word is correlated with other words in the underlying text. And that big row of numbers is just called an embedding. But what we find when we do that is that words with similar meanings have very, very similar embeddings. So if you imagine using that big string of numbers to kind of plot the words in space, what you would find is that words that are used in similar ways, words that have similar meanings, exist in similar places in space. And you can start to predict where other words, other concepts would be, even if you haven't seen them yet. So if you know where dog is and cat is, and you know where the sound that a dog makes is, you can probably predict where the sound that a cat makes is going to be in that underlying space. And so this is useful for all sorts of things. It's useful for predicting, the next word in a sequence. It's useful for translating between languages. But we can also take that same principle and apply it in a graph platform. So instead of looking at a bunch of text to see which words are associated with each other within a graph, we actually already have those relationships predefined. So in this case, the embedding would just be a long list of ones and zeros, essentially. Which concepts is this connected to and which is it not connected to? And we can create that kind of mapping between every significant concepts that we're interested in for a particular problem. So let's say we have a family of drugs that we're interested in, or a drug that we're thinking of repurposing for another condition. So we might be able to look at the existing drugs in the graph and produce these embeddings to see what relationships do they have to targets, pathways, conditions, research literature, and so on. And then we can take those embeddings and we can pass them for our training data one at a time into a neural network. So we know what the output should be for that training data. So we pass each embedding through the graph from the input layer out to the output layer. And from the output layer, we get a result. If the result is correct, that's great. If not, we work our way back through all of the millions of nodes in the neural network and adjust the weights and balances on each one to get us closer to optimizing it for the results that we want to get. Once we train that on a sufficient amount of data, then we can start passing in new candidates, new drugs. Obviously, it's a very simplified example, but use that neural network model to classify those and see if they're likely to have the same properties, the same potential as the things that we looked at in our training sets. Now, you don't have to understand every part of how that works, but there's a couple of really important things about this. So first of all, whereas in the first example I showed you the classical machine learning approach, the user had to go in and manually figure out what features, which connections, which links between concepts are important. In this case, the neural network can just tune itself and figure out what's important on its own. And that's incredibly powerful because it means that the network is able to spot things, spot connections and patterns that a human going in with a bunch of assumptions might never even think of and could completely miss. But it's also important to understand that kind of with power often comes more problems. And in this case, the problem is that these sorts of more sophisticated techniques rely more heavily on the data being complete, being accurate, not having strange anomalies in it in the first place. And the problem here is that because what it's learning is kind of buried in the middle of this neural network, if the model is wrong for some reason, it's a lot more difficult for a human being to come in and look at it and understand why. Like if there's just some weird anomaly in the underlying data, for example, you don't really know how that's filtered into the results. So more broadly, I think when you're using different AI and machine learning approaches, it's important to recognize that however powerful an approach is, it always has structural limitations, things that are inherent to that technology. And often people get fixated on using a specific particular approach, but actually in many cases, the best way to solve a problem is not to try and find the single best technology, but to use a basket of techniques in combination in a way that kind of complements and helps to mitigate each other's weaknesses. I come back to a slightly simpler example now, but this is almost taking us to the next level. So we've talked about people curating data to feed to an AI. We've then talked about the AI just taking that graph and crunching it down to figure out the relevant features for itself. But what if an AI could ask questions to a knowledge graph in a similar way to how a human does? And this is a really interesting thing that's beginning to emerge around another new technology, that of large language models. So I won't give the large language models presentation again, because I'm sure we've all heard versions of it recently, but essentially, these are an incredibly exciting technology. They are very, very powerful when it comes to taking input from a user and figuring out what that user wants to know, what they're trying to find out. And that is incredibly important for our sort of long-term goal of increasing the range of people who can work with these kinds of solutions and get meaningful results from them. But as I was saying, like any technology, LLMs have some inherent flaws and things that are limitations of fundamentally how they're built. So specifically, LLMs don't store knowledge. And as a result of that, they can be prone to accidentally making things up when they're trying to produce results. So there are a number of proposals for how LLMs can work with knowledge graphs to try and mitigate that. So, we've looked, for example, at things like putting a human in a loop to make sure that results are validated. But one thing that's become quite popular, certainly, I guess, in the last several months, is the idea of retrieval augmented generation, which is a fairly sort of over-the-top name for something that's actually a very, very simple concept, which is what if the LLM can check its answer against the knowledge graph? So let's imagine I want to ask a question about clinical studies for a particular pathway linked to lung cancer, say. I'd start by asking the question to the LLM through perhaps a chat interface. The LLM, rather than just directly giving me an answer to that, would extract the key concepts from what I've told it and pass that as a query back to the knowledge graph. The knowledge graph is then used to kind of populate the results with accurate information, sends that text back to the LLM as a new input, and the LLM is then able to process that with the original question to produce a response that has been augmented with knowledge from the graph. And this has a number of advantages. One is that it helps to mitigate the risk of the LLM making stuff up. It's still possible, but at least now it's taking reliable source information to draw the conclusions, not just what it's in its own underlying internal model. And secondly, it provides that collaboration around auditability and an understanding of an explainability of what the results are being based on. So as an end user, I don't just have to take the LLM's word for it. I can actually see what's being produced from the original graph query and have a look at that and check out for myself whether I think that the summary that I'm being given is correct or not. And that brings me to sort of maybe a larger thing that's common to all of these approaches, which is that all of them are essentially creating new knowledge and new information from the graph via an ML or AI process. They're often creating new edges, new relationships between, say, a drug and a target, or new analyses which we want to incorporate back into the knowledge that we have. And I think that the big irony of a lot of large-scale ML implementations that we see built on knowledge graphs is that you see companies that are going to the effort of building that graph, breaking down their data silos, bringing all of this knowledge into one place. They run an AI or machine learning algorithm over the top of that. They take the results from that, and then they dump it somewhere that's not actually connected back to the original graph. So essentially, we're just creating another data silo full of AI-generated data alongside that lovely, rich source of knowledge that we'd already created. And of course, the velocity and volume of the data and models that we can generate with AI is potentially very, very high. I mean, you could be running these things every time the graph updates, for example, and generating endless versions of knowledge and results. And it's kind of a shame because knowledge platforms are the ideal place for then storing metadata about those models, about those analyses, and linking them back to the original source data to make them available to researchers using that knowledge platform. And when we're bringing knowledge back into the graph, that's where the existing capabilities of knowledge graphs and knowledge platforms become really important. So the ability to manage provenance and the ability to set policies around provenance. So you can say, okay, I want to use the results of these analyses, but only the ones that we have very strong confidence in. Or maybe I don't actually want to use any generative content at all. I just want to stick with the pure kind of human-generated knowledge that I'm used to. So bringing this back in gives us these really fine-grained tools for how we can then recycle and use those analyses in further applications. And again, I think this is where the evolution of the UX of knowledge platforms is going to be very important, and where I can see there being a increased importance of things like human-in-the-loop validation, because bringing this knowledge into the graph is going to make it ever more important to provide some sort of oversight on what's there and how it's being used. And before I hand back to Michael or over to Michael, I just wanted to sort of look into my crystal ball a little bit and talk a bit about where I kind of see this going over the next few years. So there's a lot of very useful features of knowledge graphs to drive AI ML applications, as we talked about. But really, what we're seeing in the kind of evolution of how people are connecting these technologies is the role of the knowledge platform as a hub and as a kind of supporting foundation for AI and ML analytics. So knowledge graphs are fantastic for managing metadata across all different types of multimodal data. And AI is becoming more and more multimodal as we go along. Increasingly, knowledge platforms are a really important core mediator for getting normalized data to AIs, which is another incredibly important thing for that kind of analysis. But more than that, I think knowledge platforms have a role as a hub for collaboration between humans and AIs. It's the one place in all of this kind of infrastructure that people and machines are able to talk a common, well-defined, well-structured language about the domain that they work in. And we're seeing an increased interest, I think, in people building architectures that situate not just the ML stack and the knowledge graph, but also more kind of orchestration capabilities that connect the two more deeply. So we're moving towards a world of knowledge graphs that are continuously updating in real time. We have machine learning processes hanging off the back of that, watching that, responding to new data, reprocessing that data, extracting new knowledge, new trends, and then feeding that back into the graph, and humans being able to inspect that new knowledge, provide some level of validation, reuse it in more analysis along the way. And I think the most exciting thing, if I look ahead over the next few years, is that this is increasingly going to be accessible to just an average business user, someone who has an interesting question, who doesn't actually care about the underlying technology or the data model or the AI, but just wants an answer on their screen with some accurate data and evidence to back it up. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what we can do with that in the future. Part of getting to that future is, of course, making sure that we follow best practices today in how we build and deploy these technologies, not just for now, but thinking about how they're going to be used in the future. And to move us on to that, I'm going to hand over to my wonderful assistant, Michael.
Thank you, Martin. Glad to be your assistant. All right. Is this sharing fine?
Yep, that's
all right, cool. So as Martin said, I wanted to take it, make it a bit more real here in the second part of the webinar, and specifically talk about best practices. So there are, let's say, 3 groups of areas that I want to talk about. Best practices related to modeling, data quality, and related to the utilization of your data. So let's start with modeling. So you can see there in the subtitle in the top, use the FAIR principles to guide you. I am giving the audience that we have in this webinar here, I am assuming FAIR is known by everybody, so I'm not going to dive into the details of or suggestions of saying, make a FAIR knowledge graph and normalize your data and annotate your data. And so I'm not going to do that. I actually assumed that to be known. I would like to talk a little bit more about some concrete practicalities that you can take into account when modeling your knowledge graph, specifically for AI ML purposes. So step 1. Consider typing your relations. So in a knowledge graph, you obviously have different entities that you're talking about. In this example here, you have drugs and targets that we're talking about, and they can be linked with each other in multiple different ways. Specifically, a drug could be an inhibitor for a target, could be a modulator for a target, and many other things. So in most situations where you want to do machine learning on top of your knowledge graph, you would actually use the typed relationship. It is important for you to make a distinction between, is it actually an inhibitor or is it a modulator? That distinction is important to make sure that the ML doesn't get fed with noise and doesn't lead to wrong conclusions. So as a general rule, I would recommend to type your relationships so that you can use them in your machine learning that way. There are, however, some situations where it may be sensible to ignore the types, to just use the fact that there are relationships there and to feed that kind of information to your machine learning. An easy example there is, suppose you want to find key opinion leaders on rare diseases, and you want to use information from clinical trials and publications to make that assessment. In that situation, it may not really matter whether or not the key opinion leader is a principal investigator or plays some other role on the clinical trial, or what role that he or she actually played in a publication. So in that sense, you would just use any type of relationship that you have towards a person and would take that into account. But as a rule, I would say type your relationships. Second example is, or a second consideration to take into account is, how do you define your canonical types? How do you find your entities? And when you're thinking about certain concepts, would you merge them into one, or would you separate them? And this may kind of sound weird that you have to take that into account, because most types would be different and it would be clear that you have to separate them. However, there are certain situations where it may make sense to merge them. An example that we see here is a phenotype versus a disease. If you're doing research around Alzheimer's, for example, and you're thinking about feeding that into an ML, then it may make sense to split a disease and a phenotype, because the phenotypes, they will involve things like memory impairment and neurological decline, and they will be clearly distinct from the disease itself, Alzheimer's disease. Whereas in cancer research, where the line between the disease and the phenotype is much more blurred, it may make more sense to merge both types into one entity and feed them as such into your machine learning algorithm. So really, depending on your use case, depending on the question that you want to answer, it really makes sense to do this mental exercise and figure out how do you want to separate your different entities. Third example, consider simplifying your links. So typically, if you would do something like drug screening, you would take things like an active substance and a protein into account, and they would be linked through all bioactivity data like bioassays, and you would use that information as evidence to feed into your machine learning, and so that you can use that data obviously when doing drug screening. Now, this is fine if you really want to use that evidence. An alternative could be that if there's only a specific subset of evidence that you would like to use, or you don't want to confuse your machine learning, you don't want to put bias on your machine learning with by feeding it certain evidence that you don't deem relevant, you could establish a relation directly from active substance to protein, representing exactly that kind of information and feeding that into your machine learning. But because basically, the less information that you feed to your machine learning algorithm that it doesn't really need, the less noise that it could potentially cause, thus improving the quality of your output. The fourth one is more related to, mostly related to large language models. So explain your model with descriptions. Suppose you want to do a search for and give me all clinical trials around Huntington's disease, and that involves blood tests. If you want to do a natural language query against a large language model containing that statement, then it is important for your large language model to understand how that information is modeled in your knowledge graph. And if your blood tests, for example, are modeled under samples in your knowledge graph, how does your large language model know that? How do you know that it will make the right link with the items in your knowledge graph? Now, the way you could help that, it's not going to be 100% accurate all the time, but definitely a thing that you can do to make that a lot better is to make sure that every entity, every property in your knowledge graph has clear descriptions, feeding additional information to the large language model so that it knows what kind of information is stored in there. Then the small screenshot that we have there is a part of the public data that we offer with Discover, where we added descriptions to all of the entities and properties that we have in the system. And you can see there that we clearly defined what a collaborator, in this case on a clinical study, is. And if we would feed that kind of information to a large language model, that is really information that that thing can then use to make the right assessment and establish the right links when translating your natural language querying. So if you want to do any natural language querying, I highly recommend feeding your knowledge graph with all of these descriptions and feeding them through to your large language model. Also, use the right ontologies. This may be, this is obviously something that you always need to do, but it is especially important when thinking about it in an AI ML context. Either way, we would recommend to always use ontologies that are industry standard and that are often approved by or used by EMA and FDA. Use ontologies that are regularly being updated and are definitely still alive. So naturally do all of those things. But even if you look within that subset of ontologies, there are certain situations where it could be beneficial to switch from one ontology to another. Now, the example that I have here on the screen is for some of our customers, we switched from UMLS to Mondo as a ontology for drugs because we noticed that the synonyms within UMLS caused overmapping with drugs, leading to wrong conclusions in the ML analysis afterwards. So really pay attention to which ontologies that you are using and make sure that you're using the right one for the use case that you have. So that really means that you have to look into what kind of granularity does the ontology provide, and is that the right level of granularity that we need for the research that we are doing. Finally, in terms of the modeling part, may be obvious or it may not be obvious, I don't know, but consider building specialized graphs. So most of us are, or most customers are trying to build an enterprise knowledge graph where all of the information is linked together, enabling as many use cases as possible. But specifically for AI ML, naturally, if it is possible to start directly from your enterprise knowledge graph, do that because it's going to be the easiest and cheapest way forward. But you may want to consider building a specialized graph for that knowledge case, for that use case, allowing you to really optimize for that use case, applying best practices as I just shared on this particular slide here. Now, if we look at data quality, this is obviously a very important one also to take into account. Either way, regardless of AI ML, this is something that is especially important for all customers in life science. But especially in AI ML, it is important because any issue with data really could lead to wrong conclusions there that you may not be noticing at first. Now, on the left here, you have, I want to just show two examples of issues that we encountered with customers with issues with data that could lead to wrong conclusions in AI ML. So specifically, the first one is around NLP, where when using a certain NLP technology, I'm not going to name the tool here, but we came to the conclusion that quite a few diseases are actually recognized as a wrong disease. You can see some examples there where glioma, for example, was recognized as a malignant neoplasm of frontal lobe, where obviously it applies to more than the frontal lobe. And this is something that you need to pay special attention to make sure that you catch these errors early. I'll talk about in a second how you could catch those errors. Another example is in certain mappings that you're using in the system, where we noticed with Medra, for example, that certain symptoms were modeled twice in the ontology, once as pain in knee and once as knee pain, which obviously means that from an ML perspective, it is considered as two different symptoms, which could lead to wrong conclusions afterwards as well. So what can you do about both things? First of all, built-in QA tooling. And this sounds like a lot of work. This may be a lot of work, but it is highly recommended to do so. Within OntoForce, we're going to be releasing Discover 7 later this year. Part of Discover 7 is going to contain a feature called Discover Assistant, which will allow you to perform natural language querying against your knowledge graph data. Now, there's going to be, for us, there were three main parts in the development of that capability. Obviously, one, just make sure that it works from a coding perspective, from a large language model perspective. Second, really, we needed to make sure that when dealing with public data, that the large language model understood how our information is modeled in our public data, which means that we needed all of these descriptions that we talked about earlier. But finally, we also spent a significant amount of time building a system to measure our quality. At this stage, we, for example, have about 4,000 natural language queries that we run on a continuous basis against our any improvements that we do to the system, allowing us to see exactly what quality do we get out of it, what is our success rate, but also allowing us to see where we have issues. If we have issues, are they more related to, for example, recognizing diseases, or more related to recognizing data that may not be recognized easily as a particular type, like numbers or dates, or is it more with how certain phrases are formulated? So really that set of queries that we test against all the time and that we have metrics of really allow us to proceed with confidence, because we know what the impact is of what we're doing. But if you don't want to spend too much time in developing that kind of tooling, a tool like Discover, a product like Discover also has some out-of-the-box tools that really help with that kind of analysis. Two that I specifically want to emphasize here is the data ingestion engine with Discover has quality control capabilities, allowing you really to respond to changes in data or errors in your data so that you can notice these things quickly. But these are going to be more, I would say, trends that you would find this way. You rarely are going to be noticing an outlier in one piece of data that way. But the visualization tools that we provide with Discover really help in that sense. There's just a simple screenshot here of the visualization of, I believe this is clinical trials that we're looking at, where you can easily see, using the facets that are there, where conditions are missing, what the start date and the end date was, how many enrolled people were there. And if you all of a sudden see something of 500 million enrolled people in a clinical study, then possibly there may be something wrong there. So using these tools and these visualization capabilities really allow you to find the outliers in your data, allowing you to respond to that, or to see what data may be double. Recently, when working with a customer, we're looking at organisms where a rabbit and rabbits, for example, were identified as two different organisms. And these things you could also easily see from within the visualization capabilities that we have. Finally, I want to talk about the utilization of your knowledge graph data towards AI ML, because there are some best practices and considerations to take into account there as well. So first of all, use only what you need. There is a tendency, or you may have a tendency, to just use everything because you have everything available and it may just be easier. However, doing so will significantly increase your runtime cost, will significantly increase your development cost, will introduce noise into your machine learning algorithm, and will just overall decrease the performance, be in terms of runtime performance or in quality performance. Either way, the performance will be reduced. So be very selective in what kind of data that you feed to your machine learning. Make sure that you have modeled it correctly and feed only what you need. Second box here is, or the second best practice is specifically for the Discover product, where we recommend our customers to use the right tool for the job. For Discover products, there are really two sets of technologies that we offer to do AI/ML analysis on top of knowledge graph data. And we recommend our customers to use the right tool for the job, obviously. So if you want to do more of an ad hoc analysis, for example, using Jupyter Notebooks, we highly recommend to use the REST API to do your analysis. But if you want to do more bulk analysis, using SageMaker or Azure Machine Learning or TensorFlow, whatever tool you want to use, we recommend to do a bulk export of that information in your knowledge graph and feed it into whatever system that you want to do the analysis on. Finally, the last best practice that I want to share is use the right format for the job. So format and tool, really. Tool for the previous box, we just discussed about how exporting data from Discover or how to use the data that is in Discover in a AI/ML context. Then which system do you feed it in, and what are the implications of that? And there are obviously a number of choices that you can make there. There are just two parameters that I would like you to take into account when making that assessment. So don't just assume that you would be pushing the information into Neptune or Snowflake or whatever tool you want to use. Really consider the implications of that. And there are really two parameters to take into account. First is the richness of the data that you send. What do I mean with richness of data? If you look at CSV or Parquet files, they're going to be more tabular structures. So if you export information from any knowledge graph, for example, Discover, into CSV or Parquet, you're only going to be having the tabular data, which means that you would lose the descriptions that are maybe assigned to your entities in your knowledge graph. You would lose the meaning of the links. You would have to reestablish them manually in whatever system you're pushing to. So there is information that is lost there, yet it is a very easy format to process. Whereas if you move towards RDF more, naturally, this is a much richer format containing all of that information, giving you more possibilities there, yet it may be slightly more complicated to deal with. And also from a cost and capability perspective, really think about where you're pushing your information to. The more you go up in this chart here towards data lakes, SQL databases, graph databases, triple stores, naturally, the more capabilities that you gain out of the box by being able to run SQL statements against it or Sparkle queries against it. However, that also comes with an increased cost that you need to take into account. So it may make sense to feed RDF files or Parquet files directly to Snowflake or directly to TensorFlow if from a cost perspective and functionality perspective, that is more suited for you. So these are the best practices that we wanted to share. This is really what we wanted to talk about today in our webinar. So I give the word to you, Carl.
Thank you very much.